Evening.
I prepared a small keynote presentation just to
Fetching?
yeah, to outline the problem to the others a bit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I also summarized a bit the batching mechanisms that are out there, also the one that I told you about with the composite.
Yeah.
Then we can discuss a bit further. We should really explore, you also had an idea to that, and I'm to have a more broad approach to that. But you mean fragment isolation, right? Where you have these arguments into the fragments.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's that. So the original approach, the original PR was fragment aliasing, which should give you kind of like with fields that you can scope them. So from there.
Oh, but I think those are two different proposals. Like that was sort of the relay style fragment isolation.
Yes.
But fragment arguments was just about the variables, like variables.
I know, but we discussed that in the working group kind of a bit together, because like with the variables, you kind of get also a scoping. Because like if you have variables on the top, then you override them in the lower levels and stuff like that.
Yeah,
that's why then. But yeah,
I remember reading somewhere, but I couldn't find it. But someone sort of reviving that recently.
Yeah, Matt is always on that, so they are really interested in that, not only for relay, but they have also like native clients internally in Facebook. And for that, they are very much interested in
for code gen purposes.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
It's about this, nullability.
No,
fragment isolation.
Yeah, fragment parameters or fragment isolation.
Okay. Yeah, totally unrelated.
Well, perhaps not completely unrelated.
Also a client use case, right? But anyway, yeah, I see.
Are we complete? Check. Maybe wait 2 more minutes and then we start. One is missing. So let's give it 2 more minutes, then we start.
I think we're complete, aren't we?
Yakov.
No, we have 7 and we have 8 in the agenda.
Ah.
What a nice shirt you have there, Kamil. It's beautiful.
Is it Yakov that is missing? Because if Yakov,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, Yakov is missing.
You're mute, Kamil. I mean, you're not, but we can't hear you when you're unmute. People
Zoom button. It's the Zoom button that's muted.
Guess now it's okay.
Oh yeah.
Then it's my headphones.
Okay. And it's on the phone. Okay, let's start. I think we can who joins later. So welcome everybody to the next edition of this working group. By being here, we all agree to the GraphQL Spec membership agreement. And just for the audience that might watch the recording, let's introduce ourselves in the direction of the order in the agenda. So I'm Michael Stipe. I'm working for Chili Cream.
I'm Pascal. I'm also working for Chili Cream.
Sorry, my next step might be, I'm Shane, I'm from Apollo.
It took me a sec to find the agenda. I'm John, I'm at IBM.
I'm Simon, I work at Apollo.
And I'm Martin. I also from Apollo.
And I'm Camille. I just found the agenda a markdown file. And I'm from the guild.
Awesome. So we had a couple of side discussions, actually me and Martin, about like the directives, how we specified them, or like the proposals that we have out there. And actually it was that Martin found an issue that I'm also working on, and that is around the way we define directives. I've have a small presentation for that. We can go into that, and it's about batching essentially. Let me share a couple of things, and we can go into that. Because in order to move a bit forward on the specification, we kind of need to validate that they work out and that we find a good solution for them, or we have to adopt the directives, the set of directives we have at the moment. So the main difference we did towards Apollo Federation, I would say, at the moment, is that we have these finder or entity resolvers, right? And what that means is that we have a more typed schema, a Strongian typed schema in the downstream services, and have, like, for instance, you can see here the products by ID and products by IDs kind of fields that we can use to fetch data from the downstream systems. And like, if you look at that, like, batching is possible, right? Because we have like these two variants where we could use a batching field, for instance, to fetch multiples. And that works if we have for instance, like the simple query, we could get all the products for all the reviews in one go from the downstream service, would maybe have a query plan that looks kind of where we first go to the review server, then batch that from the products graph and compose that into a result. But what we stumbled on is that this is not the problem. At the moment you have something like requires, right? And this is also a difference towards what Apollo Federation is doing, for instance, at the moment. That we kind of said, if we are not having these batch fields that Apollo Federation has, like this entities field, then we kind of need also to change the way we annotate requirements, and we could inject them kind of on arguments here and say this argument is actually a requirement that gets data from somewhere else in the graph. But this leads to a dilemma, because like when we would use now this field batching approach where we get now multiple products by ID, then we have a problem to pass on the requirements in this case, where zip, the size and also the weight cannot be batched through because, because we can just specify them one and we cannot specify them for each of the product IDs here. This is the same like if you had nested batching, you cannot move like just one of the windows. You don't have a windowed function like in SQL or so, right? Okay, this is actually where Apollo has used entities for, where they basically have these representations where they can put arbitrary data in. It's not arbitrary, it's actually a partial data of an object. And then they don't have this batching problem, right? They could just solve that here. Not the nice thing is that it's any, but it is one of the solutions. And it's also one of the solutions we have to look at, right? So I went a bit through the internet and looked what is out there. And there are a couple of things that I found, some wider known, some more, maybe just 2 or 3 GraphQL servers implemented. There's request batching, which I think is the widest used way to do batching. And it's also supported by the widest amount on GraphQL servers. There's operation batching. That is kind of what Facebook did. I'm going through them in detail, so don't worry. There's something variable batching, but this is something I found in a GraphQL server. It's not what I think you're thinking about, Martin. It's very, very, I think I found it in 2 servers. A unique solution, but I don't know. There's alias batching. There's field batching, and that's basically with the entities resolver. And then I discussed a bit the problem with Benji, and we came up with a very specific solution to this specification. And just throwing that in there, and I hope we all have more ideas on that and explore it further. So first off, actually that's in the wrong order, but there's operation batching. That's what originally Lee Byron proposed in 2015, end of 2015, after they actually just said here's GraphQL. They already had this kind of approach where you could post a document with a couple of operations, and then in the route you would specify the operations that you want to invoke of this document, and you also had this export directive between them, and you could like flow data from the first execution into the second execution. I don't know if anybody remembers that. This is also a precursor of the defer specification, but yeah, kind of. And then there's request batching, and that is the simplest thing, but also most GraphQL servers implement. It's basically we post the request multiple times to the backend. It's not ideal in the thing that we want to do, because like we would need to commit the document multiple times, right? And could not be the most efficient way. There's this one I found. I don't know if anybody saw that. Ever?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is actually the one I was getting at as well. Like the issue from 2017 I sent you, I think, is doing something similar.
Yeah. Yeah, I've like there are 2 or 3 GraphQL servers out there that actually implement that.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And that is kind of it's actually kind of this, right? This just more compact.
Yeah,
Like,
but with an added constraint that it's
Yeah.
sort of it's over the same query, so that could
exactly.
that could make a GraphQL server implement this in a more effective way as well and support efficient backend fetching, for instance.
Essentially solve the issue that the other batching has, right? That when you have multiple times the same operation, that you have to commit the document multiple times. We can do it.
Yeah. And by doing that, it also sort of the contract is also more specific. So that allows service to optimize this because it knows that it's executing the same operation multiple times with different arguments.
Yeah.
You a collection of arbitrary operations.
You actually could handle that as a node field, right? You could have one execution cycle instead of like with the request execution, you basically run the GraphQL engine multiple times. But in this case, if you implement it optimally, you could treat it like a node field is invoked with an array of this, essentially. It depends on how you want to do that.
Yeah.
There's also alias batching. This is kind of, I wouldn't go there.
Yeah, that's a no-go.
because it has multiple problems. First, like by using aliases, you kind of have not stable syntax. That means GraphQL server that are more advanced cannot optimize. It's like the typical, we cannot build query plans because we constantly get new queries. It's
Same.
also like nullability could be a problem here. Like if it's not well done, like an error in one field could erase the whole result for us. Things like that. So it's not an ideal solution, but just to have it on the map, it's also something existing. Yeah, there's also this, and like we shouldn't discard it. We should look at it. It could be our fallback plan if we don't come up with a solution for all the other things. And then there is this guy here, which is what Benji and I were working on. It's kind of goes into the same direction than a variable batching, where we kind of side pass data into the execution in order to have a very efficient request and just have one execution. In this case, we are passing in the size and weight that are our requirements here into the execution for each field.
And
like
where's the mapping
Yeah.
between the entity data and the variables specified? Is that sort of implicit by name, or?
Yeah, so we have here the type name that we have. Like
Oh no,
so
but I
this is
mean,
for-
there's a size
Yeah.
variable and a weight variable,
yeah.
and the fact that it matches up with field names here, is that by convention?
Oh, is this you mean this?
Yeah.
That it matches up here. Yeah, it's the variable name basically that we have here. That is not declared, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like it's a bit inspired by what Facebook originally did with the export directive. So the things that you export, you don't have to declare. You could also do that. Like, I mean, this is absolutely not polished. There are lots of other issues with it. What if we had here, like, it's not usable in any case. That's why if we get to something like variable batching, it could be useful for other things. Like also for client concerns, whereas if we go this is really focused on doing it for the gateway, because like we couldn't do aliases, for instance. If you think about aliases, because the evaluated data is here very much primed on type, we would have to rethink how this payload is, right? If we had, for instance, products by ID 2 times aliased, it wouldn't work anymore out.
No.
Yeah, I think if we split this up into data and variables, like variables being a separate object from data, what Apollo's already been discussing, Martijn and like me and Lenny, is like if we just the data object actually being data fields, we've already discussed ideas of doing something like where you can pass context around between execution services, right? And this is exactly
Yeah.
like kind of how we imagined it would work, something like that too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the same issue basically, because we also need a form of batching for that context mechanism.
Yeah, the problem with context is that it sounds a lot like something that you can abuse to pass along stuff that is not specified by the schema. Because now we do have internal fields that only the gateway knows exists on the downstream services that the gateway can use to move data around, right? But these fields are not exposed. But there's still a very strong contract between the subgraphs and the gateway, because every field that is possible is somewhere defined. Now, when there's an arbitrary context object that flows around, it's probably going to be likely that soon there's data flowing around which is not specified at all, you know, just because you can.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think another question here is like irrespective of sort of where that data lives on the request, but is it by entity, sort of a or is it sort of nested under a variable? Like, are we thinking about this in terms of representations of entities, or a relationship between variables. Like if you think of product IDs as a list of IDs, then sort of size and weight are, you might call them dependent variables. Like you would need to nest them basically for each value of product ID. And that's specifying it at the level of variables, and this is specifying it at the level of entities. I think those are two approaches that we might want to consider.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes, that's very right. Like this is like the idea. It's a kind of a mix of what entity does, but kind of typed through the variables that you have here with size and weight. But it suffers essentially also a lot of the same issues in the end, because like for this we have to rewrite a lot of validation logic. Like if you think about validation of if there are certain variables fulfilled and stuff that we have in the execution engine. If on the other hand we go with a more general proposal of the variable batching, it basically it could flow through. It could already, like in the simplest of cases, you just do a for each loop around your execution and it would work if you feed up the request. Not the most efficient thing, but there would be a very easy path to implement that, and there could also be very efficient ways to implement that.
Yeah.
So this is
and I think there are also variants on this that we might want to consider, because this is sort of a flat list of variables, but that would lead to duplicated information. Like the zip value, for instance, would be the same for every product, but would be duplicated here.
Yes.
So you might also want to consider a representation of a batch of variables where there's a form of nesting in there, where you sort of nest, for instance, size and weight under a product ID or something.
What Benji does in Graphast, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure now, but I believe he does something like this, is that it's actually a nested array, and each item, so it's a nested array, and each item represents an argument. So instead of having objects as arguments, you just have nested arrays. And the first array is the values for A, and the second array is the values for B. Right?
Yes.
What you have then is you don't have the overhead of having to specify the object parameters, A and B, all over again. And you would also have the possibility to have constants. Because if one member of the root array is not an array, but just a value, then you would know that it's the same for all the executions.
Yeah. And would there ever be, I mean, I think there are also cases where you might want to support multiple levels of nesting. Like if you have a query where instead of products by IDs, you have like reviews by ID, then the products, and then within each product you have size and weight. How would you support something like that?
In this kind of approach?
Yeah, just thinking out loud.
Yeah, I mean, you could potentially create a tree here, right? This could be a tree. I mean, it depends on, like, we have to flesh that a bit out.
Yeah.
The problem around that. It's also just to be sure, like, this is sometimes felt and as if it's not as efficient, but with algorithms like gzip, it's often not a problem because that will eliminate that in any case.
That's true. Yeah.
I wanted to, you highlighted that point. I wanted to make sure I clarified that too, because I think we should, as a spec, like if we the other proposal where it was batching, which is like repeat the entire operation multiple times too, right? Like, and we're concerned was, oh, we're repeating the query document. Like, I'd rather opt for a spec that has more flexibility, and I could do the same operation, different operations, or whatever it is, and how we do it, whether it's with array batching entities, anything like that. But like, I don't think we should optimize for trying to like not repeat specific things like the operation, which we can say, if you want to reduce the size, use other things like persistent queries or hashing, or the other mechanisms being proposed by the GraphQL spec. Like, I think there's other ways we can optimize like post HTTP request size, and it shouldn't be like our primary goal for this group to like make that the most like thing we want to optimize for.
I don't think that's the main. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No.
Oh no, I just wanted to say that I think that's only one of the concerns. I think the other concern is efficient implementation of batched operations, and a convention like this where on receiving the request, the server knows that it's sort of repeating the same operation multiple times, can be implemented more efficiently than an arbitrary collection of operations.
Yeah, that I agree. Like the thing with the variables here is very clear to the execution engine that we are executing this guy here, and we just iterate through these things. And this could be done. Like, as I said, it could be as efficient as just implementing like how Node is implemented, or entities in many cases. So we don't have to recreate every time the whole execution cycle. Whereas with like the request batching, it's a whole more analysis that you would need to do it as efficient as with this on execution wise. You had to analyze a whole lot of stuff.
You have to hash all the
like just one note, like for the payload efficiency, I think Benji wrote a good blog on that. Like, he showed a couple of things how gzip, and there was something else in JSON, is even in many cases more efficient than protobuf in compressing this thing. So we like the repetition is not a main concern. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, and I think in a couple of previous sessions, we've established this value that we want to have fully backward compatible behavior with the GraphQL spec. Like, we don't want to introduce new behavior in the like the source schema, right? So something like a variable array, to my knowledge, isn't supported today, but something like alias batching is. Is that a correct understanding, and is that some value that we still want to hold?
So
technically,
there are two things here. Like introducing a more efficient way to batch doesn't make it not backwards compatible, because we could decide, like, from a gateway router or whatever there is on top that decides for query planning, it could also take into account like this subgraph doesn't have this capability, and then doesn't do it like that, and has like a more inefficient way to do it. That's an implementation detail that I would leave up to each implementer how they do that and how they probe that. But also this kind of, like, if we look from a GraphQL executor, could be easily done in the way just that we just run the executor multiple times. So I wouldn't be concerned on the compatibility here. I don't know
I
how
think alias batching in particular has some serious issues. Like, you're basically dynamically constructing operations, which means that some of the optimizations that GraphQL servers apply cannot be used, like caching parse documents and using operation hashes to cache other parts, like the query plan.
Yeah, it's not.
But it's also a limited approach, because it doesn't really solve the nested variables issue.
And it also has the one issue, like with this, that people often in the first thought about that don't account for, is like, if product is designed in a way that it's non-nullable, if you, for instance, cannot get a product, but you can get the other products, B and C, then the first product would actually erase the whole result, right? Because of non-null propagation.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's a graphical.
Would we
If the schema is designed well, it doesn't happen, but it could.
would we also have that issue though if we wanted? Right now we're saying go get reviews, and then only Gateway is making this special known query to get product info, right? But what if we needed product and user info? Like let's say that's all in one subgraph, right? So it's product and users, and we're fetching two entities from one subgraph. That we'd ideally want to put that in one query, right? A query string, like the observation string, right? So you'd want to get like both products and users in one request, and all of them if we can. So all the other approaches too, where we're putting like the query string and following the format, but they also have that issue, or do we also want to be able to allow you to fetch multiple different types of entities and also have that not impacted?
I don't think that's actually something we want to do. It's not what we currently do either in the query planner. Like often, like fetching, for instance, a list of users and a list of product, they have their own performance characteristics. You might want to cache them separately. Actually doing those requests in parallel against a subgraph might be more efficient than trying to get everything in one request. Like just limiting the number of requests to subgraphs by itself is not always the most efficient way of implementing a query plan. So I think the restriction here of always getting a batch of basically the same shape, I think that's actually a good restriction. And even though our underscore entities approach doesn't have that limitation, in practice, I don't think we actually use that to perform like batches that combine different shapes or different types of entities.
I think we do. We still optimize. Do we still optimize the query planner? Apollo's query planner today always optimizes for number of subgraph requests, and you can have the entities have different, like an user entity and a product entity, and like it will have all those different entities and marked with keys in there. Now, I agree with you. This could be an implementation detail of all the different composition gateways, and you could decide I want to put them all together, or I want to split them up and based off metadata, and we don't need to specify this and that in the spec. But like, do we want the option to be there? And I guess, or should we have that? Should we clarify that that should be two different requests, and we should only be requesting one entity given like this thing, right? Or this query you're making.
I mean,
or one entity type.
It is possible to do it with this, right?
Yeah, it would be possible to do it with this pattern, but I'm saying if you use this pattern here, you would say query products by ID and users by ID, and then you'd have multiple variables.
You could theoretically use includes for it, and then you could fetch multiple root types. So when you, for example, have get product and get whatever, you could just have an include on the root, and then you pass in the variable for the includes.
What do you mean by an include here?
In the query,
Pascal, I think it's about you're thinking wrong, because like the thing is to get the things at the same time without the effect of null propagation. But I think like the optimization that you could do as a gateway, but I wouldn't anyway prescribe or force a gateway to implement like the strategy to fetch something in the specification. Like this should be the implementation detail of each vendor, like how they do that. We just need to make sure that there are the utilities around that. The other thing is like you could still fetch two entities, right, in this, as long as the finder or entity resolver is nullable. The gateway would just need to account for that. If it's nullable, like we can terminate the result at the root field, then you could batch them together.
Yeah. In general, I think that's probably something we should recommend against. Another
but
issue
I
is
mean,
just that
that's-
you're basically blocking one fetch and another.
But I mean, as said, you don't even need nullability, right? Couldn't you just use skip and include to skip over the root field? Done. Then you can fetch whatever.
No, Pascal, because you want to get them in the same request. It's not about skipping them.
But in this batching approach, you would still do it, right?
No, it's like you have a set of variables that you want to get,
Yes.
and you want to get them in the same request. Or you mean, I get what you mean. I get what you mean.
You can just have a flag which entity you want to fetch, and then.
But then you still have the problem, like, let's say you have the same variable set for each, and maybe this variable set here A is a non-nullable int, and for the second request you also have to provide always a value then.
Yeah, but you can just have fillers, right? If it's an unnullable int, you just pass a zero. I mean, it's just a shape. It's still possible, but I think the point that you raised before is really good. I don't think that there are so many approaches, all have their benefits. Even if you start combining them, they also get interesting, because then suddenly you can do batching and variable batching. So you can have two requests batched, and each has a batch of variables. So then you can execute two queries completely different on the subgraph in one go, and stuff like this. I mean, isn't this just all different fetch patterns, like you said, that you shouldn't be specified? It's just you can support them or not. The fallback is just n+1 requests. That's like the bare minimum would be that you do n+1.
But I think it's like when we say it shouldn't be in the spec, I like disagree, because like the transport is like critical part. Like, for example, you can have like how the gateway is supposed to know that the underlying service, the subgraph service, whatever, is capable of receiving the request, right? It would have to like, first be aware of it, right? So then you have like, you would have to have a spec to actually say, oh, I'm capable of doing this method, right? Or I'm capable of doing that method. And then the gateway will have to like check which, method is actually right for that particular subgraph, right? So it's like, it's super complex, and I think it's like not necessary to have like multiple options. About the include and skip, it's a good idea, except there's one flaw, because if like it hits the same issue with like parsing and caching the parse result, because every time you will get the document, it will be different. One, name of the variables, but also the body of the document. So because it will be like batched together. So yeah, this approach, I'm not sure about like those methods. I think it should be part of the spec. Like, for example, Apollo Federation, it's already part of the spec, right? Like, it's not really like specified or whatever, but the transport is like, it has some assumptions, right?
Doesn't the Apollo Federation has the similar thing, that the request to the downstream service is different depending on what entities you fetch, right? So in the planning step, you plan, even now, I know, Martin, you said that you only fetch one entity, but let's say that you fetch multiple entities, then depending on which entities are part of the node of the entities field, you would have a different selection set in the query as well, because you would fetch more than one entity. So
yeah, I think as far as I know, that we don't do that. So you always have a fixed query shape at a certain level of the query plan, and then you pass in the representation of those entities. But you're right, we would have the same issue there. You'd have to you'd have to put a type condition on there, for instance, because we always pass in a type name.
One thing which I didn't understand before was, what do you meant by nested? variables.
That's a good one, because I actually think this doesn't solve that problem. So for something like the product by ID, we so if you think about these variables as sort of a flat batch, then basically the simplest form is for every product ID you have a set of dependent variables, so like size and weight. But that assumes basically that you're executing the query for every value of the product ID. But there could be cases where what you're passing in here, for instance, is not a product ID, but it's a review ID, and then product is listed under there, is nested under there, or something more complicated, of course, like orders and then delivery estimate. Like if I have a recent orders and then products.
Can we construct this quickly?
Yeah, this like this, or how do you mean it?
Yeah, I think this is an example, but here you're still passing in the product ID.
Yeah, but you don't want the product ID to be passed in, rather.
No, I think basically you run into the issue every time the key, like you're not passing in a key to a root field, but it's some kind of nested field where you're passing in, or where you're meant
like
to
when we
pass
go
in.
through a viewer or something.
No, I think that would actually work, because it's sort of transparent. But if this is not review but reviews, for instance,
Yes.
then we have multiple, like there's no you can't execute this query multiple times for each product, basically, because the top level is not a product by ID.
Yeah, but isn't that the key discussion about Finder? Like you will only ever query Finder through this pattern, right? And a Finder or an entity resolver, or however it's called in the end. Basically, we even have an open issue, I believe, on the spec, if it can be a non-root field or not. So like,
yeah, as long as
but it's not a Finder.
Yeah.
Like there could still be a Finder here. This could still be a review by ID, for instance.
I mean, you would get the list of reviews, right?
Yeah, and then this might not be a good example because there's a one-to-one relationship here between each review and product. But let's say this is products plural, for instance.
But we have in here a variable.
No, just reviews and products, I believe.
Reviews and products, okay, like this.
Yeah, but I wanted reviews to still be a Finder. So I wanted that to be reviewed by ID, or maybe it's order by ID, for instance. That might be a good one.
Okay. Like this?
Yeah. So now we have a list of order IDs. But then what we need to pass into delivery estimate is the size and weight of each product for that order.
Yeah, but is that an issue? Because wouldn't that just be another Finder request on product?
I mean, we could break it up. Like we could.
I mean, how will you do this in Federation now? Because then you would get. Doesn't Federation have does the entity pattern solve this problem?
No.
We would also need to break it up here.
Right.
But yeah, and we use.
We don't support arguments, so it's not a problem because we don't support it.
And for requires
requires on arguments, it's not supported.
No, but I mean requires in general, like you would only use that if information came from a different subgraph. So you would always need to break up the query. So for instance, if size and weight came from a different subgraph, you would always first get a list of products, and then for each product get the size and weight, and then call back to get the delivery estimate. So
because otherwise you don't know what requirements you have.
Yeah,
like you need.
also that's going to be really difficult if you bind now let's imagine that what we have on delivery estimate, we have just zip. If you just add zip as a variable on delivery estimate quickly.
What do you want to have, Pascal?
On delivery estimate, just add the zip code as
Here,
an argument.
Yeah.
Yes. Because you mean this case, right? Now you would actually need somehow to map the product to the correct zip code.
I think the zip code is a query variable, actually, right? It's something passed
Yeah,
in by default.
Yeah,
let's say I mean you could
if
just
the user passes this in, it's anyway not solvable in GraphQL, right? Like a user parameter would not be a concern
Yes,
for us in this.
that's what we have
No.
with nested pagination nowadays, right? It's the same thing. You cannot do after in nested pagination because there might not be an after, or it's just not defined. But here, if we think about that, products would be required, that zip would be required from another subgraph, which defines it on products, whatever. Then you would have this issue now. But what's really difficult is that products has to be an entity as well, because otherwise you will not be able to link the ID to the required argument, and that in itself implies that there should be an entity resolver to fetch the entity. Otherwise, the satisfiability rule would probably not be good anyway.
I think that makes sense. I think restricting a require to entities. I mean, similar to like we also currently restrict requires to entities. I think that might make sense.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't matter, right? If like you have something like this actually, and then it doesn't need to be like we can restrict it, no worries. But like it wouldn't be actually a problem if you have product by ID or whatever, and then we have here some data, which is just a single item, right? In this case, you wouldn't have a problem. It's a problem when we have here a list.
You have to have a one-to-one relationship to an entity. That's and you
this starts becoming a list.
Yeah, and you require an entity in this because you mean when you require, okay, I see. You require an entity in the middle. Because the problem is if you do not require an entity, then you will have all sorts of problems. What if, for example, in the example before where we had reviews and products, and now you will pass in an array or whatever of zip codes for the products which were returned, something like this. If products were not an entity, then you would have the issue that if the order of the list changed for whatever reason, optimized database calls, then it doesn't make sense. You need to link this zip variable to the ID of the entity. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. You cannot go off based on an index, an order, or whatever. You always have to link the requires to an entity ID. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
And another reason for that is that require is meant to fetch data from another subgraph. And in order to perform a subquery against another subgraph, you need an entity to traverse that relationship. Like the entity key is what allows you to enter the subgraph for that entity.
And also requirements kind of can be used to resolve internal data also, like that you need from another subgraph, right?
Maybe you mean within a single subgraph?
Yeah.
I mean,
no, within a different subgraph? Right? You can also grab internal data from another subgraph.
Oh yeah, no, of course it can be internal data. It doesn't have to be part of the public API, but you still need to traverse to another subgraph. And in order to do that, you need an entity key. Like if there's no way of identifying a product
Yeah.
across subgraphs, you can't require fields from other subgraphs.
Yeah, the general rule there is like you have to fulfill the key, but I also have some additional requirements. So that's like step one, and then you need to fulfill the rest in order to like resolve the field, right? That's correct.
Yeah, but the order is probably different. Like you would probably get the required fields from another subgraph first, and then passing
Yeah,
both.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, but that's the idea. Yeah.
It's good. I mean, out of this discussion already came a good input. Also, like how we describe the require directive. Kind of, that's something we need to put into the require specification, actually. Like the constraints, what are the constraints of requires? Where can we use it? Like,
Yeah.
I would, you know, independent of what direction we go with any of these things in the specification, if we would, can we start collecting just examples of how we think that stuff should work, that we have a base of discussion, because there will come so many examples together of how requires work in the next couple of months, that when we start collecting them, we don't forget them, that once we have a solution and the specification ready, that we can go back and see if we missed something or if we should change the wording in the specification, whatever, just so that we don't talk about it now and in 3 months no one remembers what requirements.
So should we kind of collect a couple of these require use cases, query use cases, or I mean,
yeah.
I guess it's based on any feature that we have. We should just
I would focus at the moment on this, so we can kind of say, okay, we find, because at the moment where I'm stuck is like in describing the chapter about the directives. If we go too broad, then we don't make we cannot check off one of them and say, okay, this probably works. So we can put that to the side and focus on the next. So I wouldn't just go.
With requires also this problem, they go hand in hand, right? Because without requires, you probably don't have the problem, I believe. Yeah, you probably don't. Because you would always go through the route anyway.
Yeah, like batching, if we didn't have require, then batching is simple because like you don't have the problem of these, or you could work around these problems.
Yeah.
Nice thing about batching, by the way, it doesn't matter which batching approach we use, but you wouldn't no longer need specifically products by ID field, because you could just batch over any field, including node, which would be so nice.
Yeah.
That was one of Martin's also concerns.
Yeah, and then another thing there is that it's also useful from a client perspective. Like clients often need a way to like refetch certain entities, for instance.
That's why we introduce nodes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Finder is basically a more like a typed version, a more flexible version of Node, like with different types of keys and specific return types.
Yeah, and also like what I think is better with specific resolvers is that people are more aware of the optimizations they need to write, and also they have a stronger type shape around it and are more flexible on the arguments.
Yeah.
One question: do we aim to be GraphQL spec compliant when it comes to those internal gateway to GraphQL API requests? For example, in this case, when we have the requires and we need to pass the variables and so on.
Technically, it would.
I mean to the spec, not like, you know, GraphQL JS or something like that, right?
No, but technically still be valid if we use variable batching, because that's not specified in the main specification. Technically.
Yeah. No, I think that's one of the reasons I like variable batching. It's part of the transport, but you're still executing the operation as usual So if
But
if we can,
it could also become part of the it could be a part of the specification, and also you could implement it very efficiently also in the execution engine. Like, yeah. It's very flexible.
I mean, there's the GraphQL over HTTP specification, GraphQL specification itself. What I meant is that the GraphQL spec itself, not the transport layer. So because the transport layer we can adjust, right? The spec itself will be a bit more challenging, I would say.
Yeah,
So,
sorry.
what I mean really is just the in React it's like prop drilling, but I mean the resolvers, you know, this phase, like the actual execution of the thing. So for example, if you write the products and then you have delivery estimate, you expect to have the values passed as a parent, like the first argument, whatever, right? So we can't break this flow, right? It has to be there.
We do break
So,
this flow actually, because we expect them to pass in as arguments. So the resolver gets them as arguments, not as parent values.
oh yeah, but if it's the argument, then exactly. So then we will have to pass it as argument. So we have to control the execution. So we have to change it slightly.
We don't need to control the execution if we pass them in as variables.
I
Like
think
if we have a list of product ID, zip, size, and weight variables, and the query we're executing is product by ID with like nested delivery estimate with those variables passed in as arguments, then I think execution would work as expected.
I think
Yeah, but you cannot. But my point is that you cannot have like multiple, like a list of arguments for a particular field. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, it's argument,
True.
but you need to pass it somewhere somehow, and this is kind of
True.
breaking the spec, no?
No, it's not breaking the spec, because we can't, like, the sales pitch here is you could implement it spec compliant if you want, because like spec compliant is you send this request into the GraphQL server, and the GraphQL server does a loop around the execution engine and invokes it for each variable set, and that would be spec compliant because it's like basically batching. But a GraphQL implementer has here an opportunity to do an optimization and a kind of optimized pass through the execution that where you could just pass this on, and the execution engine itself has a more optimized execution path, and that would still be spec compliant. As you have the normal flow, and like we just did an optimization, like we have a ton of these kinds of optimization.
Which approach specifically? Because if it's the last one, I know exactly what you mean.
I was thinking of the variables batching approach. I think that can be implemented in a spec compliant way pretty easily.
Exactly. That was also my argument. Like this guy here can be implemented in a spec compliant way, where we just do essentially a loop for each variable. We do an invocation. Like this would be the easiest way to implement it actually, and also the like 100% spec compliant. But you could, like, as an implementer, say, okay, I have a much more efficient way of doing that, so I'm standing in these variables, and then we deal with that in the execution engine. As I said, you could even treat it as there is just like a node field or whatever.
But
am I wrong in thinking that the spec? Am I wrong in thinking that the spec is saying a request contains one set of variables and one query, or one operation, I should say?
Sure.
So a transport could contain multiple requests, but they wouldn't be. I mean, I don't know. It seems like we're mixing definitions of what a request is here.
No, like if we introduce that in the, let's say in the GraphQL over HTTP spec, then we could invoke the execution engine. There are two terms here, right? If we just do it on the transport level, like the execution engine could run the same way, because we could invoke for each variable here one GraphQL request to the GraphQL executor that sends basically this in and this in, and then it's standard GraphQL.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I see the rerunning it part, but the part I'm not understanding is how this lines up with the spec saying a request sent to the server behaves this way. Right?
There's
Are
a
we
difference
saying
between
that-
a GraphQL request and like an HTTP request, for instance. Like there's
Exactly.
not necessarily a one-to-one mapping.
It is not.
It's too.
The
It's too,
GraphQL transport specification explained that also. Like the GraphQL over HTTP specification, like we already did a couple of batching discussions there. Like it doesn't have to align the way that it's done. And I mean, we can just introduce it as a specification, a proposal as an RFC, and then it's done. We can also say, like, if you want to be an optimized GraphQL subgraph, then you implement this specification. If not, then you will be invoked more often.
So I just want to call out the one point I wanted to make. If you sent this JSON post body to Apollo server and basically any GraphQL server
Yeah.
today, it would fail. It would blow up. It
I
wouldn't
know.
parse this, wouldn't serialize this. So that I think is the primary concern everyone is having. We can get around that by, because like the variables is optional, completely optional. Like we could call it composite variables, and there you go. We solved the problem, right? But I think that's the concern that we're all, like John and Camille are all trying to get across here. Like right now, at this basic proposal that's just proposed right now in this meeting, technically would break every implementation. So
it
there's
depends.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not
the-
breaking
the-
the GraphQL specification, but it is breaking the transport. And
Yeah.
and renaming the field wouldn't work either, because like you'd basically have
Yeah,
an invalid query with missing variables in that case.
yeah.
But I would.
just the outline. What I want to do is kind of, we are not settling for one solution, right, at the moment. It's just, let's discuss without like limitations what would be an optimal way out for us. Like what could we do to make that efficient? And then we can still see, okay, the impact to the ecosystem is too big to do that. We can still come to this conclusion, but I wouldn't just stop thinking about it because we are there. Because the GraphQL transport specification at the moment also doesn't describe, like, there's no batching. Batching is a non-spec compliance thing, and not all GraphQL servers do it.
But I think
like,
yeah. What I meant really is not just the variables, but the nested variables. So if you want, like if you have require, that's what I mean. Like instead of passing a variable to a field, you pass a variable that is actually a list that should be, like, I don't know, let's say the field, and then you have the zip, right, within the product or something. So then it's not variable, it's like an element of an array. That's what I mean.
But this wouldn't happen here. This wouldn't happen.
In
wouldn't
this
happen here.
case, if you have like the require and you have to pass exactly with the zip, right? So if that's not compliant with the GraphQL, then we kind of like, like we cannot move forward, right?
Yeah, but
I
we
think
have-
we
we
I think
have another-
we can make it compliant. But the difference is, yeah, as Michael is doing here, what you basically want to do is flatten the list, and instead of something like products by ID, you have a product by ID. And in that case, you just have a flat list of product ID, zip, size, and weight. And as long as you can flatten the variables in that way, and that would come with some restrictions, like only putting
can.
require on entity fields, for instance.
you can always. You have.
What if it's a list? Like what if the
what is
product
a
by-
list?
Then,
Exactly, like you can have like a size that it's like you can have a delivery that is actually a list. So
yes, but that doesn't.
like products or like products by ID or something like that. Like it could be like,
It's the example that we had before with the orders and the reviews, right? You have
Yeah.
you have orders and you have reviews. I don't think that this is an issue, because you have to have another finder for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. It doesn't. It also doesn't work in Apollo Federation now. It has to be an entity. You have to fetch it in a different fetch, because you need to have the correlation between the item and the ID. You cannot pass in, if you have a list, a nested list, you cannot just pass in a list of variables, because between two fetches, it could be that this list, and it's very likely in distributed system, that this list looks completely different, Because the only guarantee that you should have in your graphical server is that in a request, the request is in itself consistent. But the order of the products in reviews could be different because maybe there is a new product in the reviews list. And then the index is not enough to match to the product. You always need to match over an ID. You need to have product ID, this zip, the next product ID, this zip, the next product ID, this zip. Otherwise, the execution is completely random.
Yeah.
And if you
I mean,
And in this case, you'd include size and weight in the query, like they'd be regular variables.
Yeah, basically, like in the list, we would have for each thing would be listed here, right?
yeah,
And we
Yeah,
would have
yeah,
style.
and also in the query document itself, like would just be a defined variable there.
that's not
And then-
really Complement really when you have products by ID. So you really have a nest.
Also, no, I meant a different thing, but we can take it like async. What I meant is that require can require a list. You know what I mean? And then the list itself can have additional fields in it, an object, and then you don't have a variable for each. You have a variable for the list. You can have a variable for each, but then it's not really a variable. It's like a, something in between. That's my issue.
But
I can provide an example. It will be much clearer.
But you would have to define.
I think it would be good to collect some examples. And
Yes, that would
walk
be
through them.
easier
Yeah.
for sure.
But
Yeah, that's also what Pascal said, right? Let's collect a couple of examples where this wouldn't work out, or like not only where it wouldn't work out, just examples that you have on requires, so we can a bit figure out if we could get away with this solution.
I think I understand now what you mean, Corinne. You mean when you require a list?
Yes.
No, that's something different.
Yeah, because you
but
can
but if you require a list, like the argument is of type list, like you're still passing in.
But the
Lists
idea
a
of
single.
require is that, like, if you put a require on a field of a product type, that it can require a field that is a list itself, right? So you could have, but maybe I'm just, that's why I'm saying, like, let's have an example, because maybe I will like validate my issues, let's say.
But in this case, like if you require a list of weights, you would require a list of weights.
Yeah, but that would work. I mean, the type of weight would then be a list of numbers, list of floats.
But
So
let's anyway, let's collect a couple of examples, and then we can work through them, how they would translate to this, and then we can see if it pans out, or if we have to adjust.
To come back quickly to Shane's thing, even if we specify that this is the way that we batch in the composite schema specification, we can still have this as a capability flagged on the subgraph, because if you cannot batch, the gateway can batch. So you can still compose any schema that you want. You can still take the GitHub graph and compose it into it theoretically with the right annotations. And it would work if the gateway knows that the graph the subgraph doesn't support the batching. Because instead of passing a variables array, you would just do n+1 requests. So there's always a fallback that you could do. Even if you don't have 17 different batching specifications that you have to implement, you could theoretically still say that you can also have no batching capabilities. And then you could use any graphical server without breaking anything of the existing world. It's just one specific case that doesn't work, right? It's when you use require. It's recommended to have dispatching capabilities, which are described in the specification.
Yeah. And my hope is that it's actually useful enough and easy enough to implement that most servers would fairly quickly implement it.
Yeah. And it's easy, like as we already said, it's fairly easy to implement if you do it simple. And but let's see. I will also forward it to Benji so he can also put a couple of thoughts into that.
Yeah.
It's always good to validate some stuff.
I wouldn't. Can you just open an issue on GitHub?
Yes, I will do it. I
have
issue.
Also a few things to add here because there might be.
Should I list in the issue? Like, yeah. Anyway, I have an RFC document where I also kind of outlined the pros and cons of each. I can just put that in the issue.
Yeah,
And then people can discuss on it. Maybe better than
that. Benji opened for the input unit stuff. We have the different approaches to table with what's the issue.
I kind of built that as a document. I can publish this, or we put it in the issue
and create the markdown table, and then we're good.
Yeah, I can whatever you like most. Can publish the markdown, or I can publish it as an issue.
The things with the RFC documents, they're nice, but the problem is that you either need
you cannot comment on them. That's the problem.
You need a pull request, an issue, or a discussion. Otherwise, we cannot comment.
Yeah. Okay. I put it in the
Right.
issue. Okay. Well, time is up. It was great. I think this meeting we did some progress.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think we've discussed some potential approaches, and now we just need to explore them further.
Yes. Awesome. So everybody, I'm putting it up on GitHub as an issue, and then you can comment, and we can see where this goes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.
All right. Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Yeah.